Hey, everybody. My guest today is Joanna Harper, and we're going to talk about transgender athletes. All right, Joanna, why don't you introduce yourself?
My name is Joanna Harper. I'm a scientist, a runner, an author, and I'm transgender.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being here. So, why don't we get right into it? I've heard a lot of discussion online about where transgender athletes should compete. And I was wondering if you could give your general thoughts on the issue.
Well, I would say that it depends on the level of competition and the age of the athlete. Um, I think if we are talking about prepubescent athletes or recreational level athletes, we should just let people uh, play and participate in sports wherever they feel most comfortable. These levels, prepubescent, for instance, there's very little difference between young boys and young girls in terms of athletic performance. And so, do we really even need to divide by sex when we talk about prepubescent athletes? And even in recreational sports, we don't necessarily need to divide into male and female categories. We can do things uh, by ability or by any other, or even not divide at all when it comes to recreational sports. So, the idea that somehow uh, letting trans people play in whichever category or no category, depending on on how things get structured, represents a threat in any way, is certainly not true. But things are very, very different when we talk about high level sports. Let's say NCAA level and above, and if we want to have women winning Olympic medals, we want to have women winning professional sports contracts or even scholarships to uh, NCAA schools, we have to have a women's division. And that division has to have appropriate eligibility requirements. And so I think we can still have transgender athletes compete in a category which matches their gender identity, but it needs to be more carefully thought out. And in particular, transgender women need to have undergone testosterone-suppressing hormone therapy prior to participating or competing in high-level women's sports. And so that's what I would recommend.
Thank you for that. So you mentioned a couple of things, and I just wanted to kind of get some clarification there. So you made a distinction between kid sports, or I guess prepubescent sports, and I guess like adult sports. Like there's a division there, and there's another division between recreational sports and perhaps professional sports. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
And specifically with the pre-puberty thing, the young boys and young girls, uh, there are some differences in how they compete in sports, but they're relatively minor. But when boys go through a testosterone-fueled puberty, they gain enormous advantages over girls. And so it is from this puberty onward that there's this huge divergence in the athletic capability of males and females, and that's when we need to start looking at things a little more closely.
Okay. So in this discussion, I feel like raises a number of different types of issues. One, perhaps we can classify as factual claims, and the other, perhaps questions about values, questions about fairness, right? And I feel like they're like raised simultaneously, and they're interrelated. So, if I'm understanding you correctly, male going through male puberty does give you a physical advantage when it comes to playing sports. Is that clear? Is the science on that clear?
Very, very clear. I recently co-authored a paper that was published, and Sandra Hunter was the first author, and she did an amazing job. But this is, I think, the definitive paper on sex differences in sport. And there's 450 references in this paper. It's an enormous paper, and Sandra really has to be thanked for it. And it looks in great detail at at sex-based differences. And you know, 450 references. That's a lot of papers. And it is as clear as it can possibly be that anyone who undergoes a testosterone-fueled masculinizing puberty gains advantages in size, strength, hemoglobin, which is important for aerobic activities. It's just across the board in so many different areas that difference between going through a testosterone puberty and the typical female puberty is just, it's so large that it is just not reasonable at high levels of sport to have men and women competing against one another in most sports.
Okay, thank you for that. I've heard some talk about bone density as well. Is that a thing? Is that relevant?
Bone density is substantially higher in males than females, and it certainly offers protection in sports where there's collisions. It also gives a better structure to hang muscle off of, and so there certainly are advantages to thicker, bigger bones, but you also have to carry that structure around. So it's not all advantageous to have larger, thicker bones, but overall, in many sports, it is.
I see. Okay. So are there any sports in which females just tend to do better?
Um, well, certainly the balance beam is something that females would be substantially better than males. Um, in terms of distance swimming, not as clear as the balance beam, but many of the top long distance swimmers, channel swimmers, and so on are women. Uh, and so, there definitely are sports, a few sports, and then there are sports like shooting where there's very little difference, equestrian. Uh, of course, the horse is a large part of the reason for that, but um, where there's not really much difference between male and female performance.
Okay. So now this ties to the values part. So, I mean, when I hear discussion about transgender athletes, it's always about trans women, right? You never, or at least I never hear discussion about trans men. And it might be because we're assuming here that for most sports, it is advantageous to be male. And so therefore it would be unfair for I guess, trans women to compete in women's sports. I think that's usually the dialogue that I hear.
That's the usual dialogue, yeah.
What I find interesting about this issue is that it raises the bigger question about what we mean by fair, right? And one example that comes to mind that kind of is related to this is in regards to people who just have certain genetic advantages over other athletes. So, for example, Michael Phelps, right? I remember watching this video about how he's just somehow more built to swim really fast. And that raises questions, because like he's competing against like other men, but at the same time, I'm not even sure if it's fair for the other men to compete against him because he's kind of like built like a human fish.
So there are all kinds of advantages that exist in sport. And you just certainly mentioned Michael Phelps's advantages. But there's two different types of advantages. One that we could call competitive advantages, and one that we could describe as category advantages. So the advantages that Michael Phelps has are certainly advantages, but uh, they certainly don't require everyone with his advantage, and then he wouldn't be the only one with built that way to go into a separate category. They're certainly going to be more successful, but then there are advantages, and especially when you're talking about populations that are large enough that we do have to put people into separate categories because of these advantages. Um, and an example or a couple of examples from typical American sports. It's advantageous in many sports to be left-handed, and certainly in baseball, it's for pitchers and hitters, it's highly advantageous to be left-handed. It's a disadvantage for shortstops, but 30% of Major League Baseball players are left-handed versus 10% of the population. So it's clear that left-handed players are advantaged in the sport, but that's an advantage that we allow and indeed celebrate. You can't listen to a baseball game without them talking about the righty-lefty thing, and so it's considered part of the sport, the inherent advantages that left-handers have. But right-handed baseball players are certainly successful as well. And so that's a competition advantage to be left-handed in baseball. If we look, say, at boxing, big boxers simply can't compete reasonably against little boxers, no matter how hard the little boxer trains, no matter how what their fighting skills are, they just can't overcome the size difference. And so size when it comes to boxing is such an advantage that the sport is divided into weight categories so that you're testing how good a boxer somebody is and not just whether they're bigger than somebody else. So, it's important to keep that sort of idea in mind. So the sort of advantages that Michael Phelps has, female swimmers can have those same advantages. There's, nothing that says that a female swimmer can't be built like a fish too. But female swimmers, haven't gone through this masculinizing puberty. And so the differences that occur with puberty are a category advantage, whereas the advantages, that Michael Phelps has are competition advantages. It's important to keep that in mind. But then, of course, if we talk about transgender women, once transgender women go through hormone therapy, trans women lose, they lose strength, endurance, and many other qualities with hormone therapy. They may not lose all of their advantage that they gained through going through puberty, but they do lose a substantial portion thereof.
Okay, so that makes sense. I like this distinction that you're making between competitive advantage and categorical advantage. I'm trying to figure out the best way to kind of separate the two and understand the difference. So let's say if there were some sort of physical difference or genetic or biological difference between large groups of people, and this difference led to a significant advantage in that sport, then that would be a categorical advantage?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. Like I've had some thoughts about this issue because I teach bioethics, and one of my classes we talk about human enhancement and whether or not, we should allow performing enhancing drugs and, stuff like that. And, it just raises this question of fairness, exactly what kind of categories should we have in sports? Like what is it exactly that we want to see displayed when people perform a sport and when we watch a sport? And it seems to come down to skill, right? We want to see this form of human excellence, which is skill, to determine, who wins and who loses. We don't want other uncontrollable things, such as, a boxer just being large. We don't want that to determine who wins, right? Would you generally agree with that?
Yes, yeah. Sport is certainly inherently unfair to a certain example, a certain degree. Ask anyone who's had to guard LeBron James over all the years. Was that fair that you had to guard LeBron James? But this idea that there are things that we want to measure in sports and we want to see succeed, as you say, skill, hard work. Um, like in my sport, if you're talking about distance running, it's not so much skill. There's some skill involved, but mostly it's training and talent and determination. But certainly in most team sports, skill is a large part of it. Yeah, these are things that we want to see rewarded uh, in sports, and not just some biological advantage. And so uh, when these biological advantages become so large that they can't be overcome by skill and training and determination, then we need to make separate categories.
Okay, no, thank you for that. I remember reading an article that you wrote for, I think, WebMD on this topic, and I thought that the article was very informative. It made a lot of sense to me, and what I liked about it is that it was very nuanced, right? If I remember correctly, you said that how we, I guess, determine what's fair really depends on what the sport is. And I think you even went into specifics like grip strength or something like that. You know, if this sport requires these type of physical capacities, then perhaps we have to draw the line here. But if it's this other sport, then we draw the line somewhere else. Can you elaborate on that a little more?
If we're talking about trans women in particular, the amount of loss will vary depending on whether we're talking about aerobic capacity or strength, for instance. It seems highly probable to me that after going through hormone therapy, trans women will have little or no advantage in endurance sports. But certainly some remaining advantages will exist in strength sports. Trans women will always be, on average, bigger and taller, bigger and stronger than cis women or typical women. And those are advantages in many sports. When it comes to the strength, it's not entirely clear whether trans women are pound for pound stronger. And that certainly makes a difference whether you're talking, absolute strength or what we call relative strength. If we're talking about track and field, in the throwing events, it's absolute strength that's important because you're throwing an implement that weighs a certain amount, and just being bigger and stronger is helpful. But in jumping events, you're using your strength to move your body. So in that sort of event, it's relative strength. Is how much strength per body mass that you possess that's important in how far or how high you can jump. And so, as I say, trans women are definitely bigger and stronger, but it's not clear whether trans women are pound for pound stronger or not. And so those are differences in, and that's the same sport. It's track and field. It's just different events within the sport. And then, as I say, if you're talking about endurance, which is, again, distance running is also part of track and field, then then you're looking at something else entirely different. So would the sport of track and field need different regulations for trans women depending on the event? That's maybe. But it's also, when we talk about the advantages that trans women have, and they certainly exist, trans women have disadvantages as well. Trans women's larger frames are now being powered by reduced muscle mass and reduced aerobic capacity, so that can lead to disadvantages in things like endurance, quickness, recovery, etc. But beyond that, the largest disadvantages that all trans people face are psychosocial disadvantages. And those disadvantages, psychosocial disadvantages, are no less real than physical advantages or disadvantages. And the marginalization that all trans people face, is a very significant factor. Trans people are suffer much higher rates of depression. Depressed people are not good athletes. And so, if all we focus on are the advantages that trans women have, we miss the total picture. And if you allow me to go on here, I think a good way to look at, if you're talking about an overall advantage or disadvantage, would be to look at population studies. And the best population study would be NCAA sports. Um, every year, more than 200,000 women compete in NCAA sports across the different levels. And trans women have been allowed to compete in NCAA sports since 2011. That's 12 years ago. And trans people make up approximately 1% of the population. There's significant error bars on that. But if we take 1% of 200,000, that would be equal representation, and hence, in a population, no advantage or disadvantage would be 2,000 trans women competing in NCAA sports every year. We don't know the exact number, but it's probably just a handful. I would say almost undoubtedly fewer than 100 trans women competing in NCAA sports in every year. And there should be 2,000. So 12 years after these rules came in allowing trans women haven't taken over NCAA sports. They're still hugely underrepresented. And that's indicative of overall disadvantage. And so this idea that, yes, trans women have advantages. If we let them in women's sports, they'll take over. Well, it hasn't happened in the NCAA in 12 years, and it's not going to happen anytime soon.
Thank you for that. I wasn't aware of those statistics. So it seems true that trans people experience it's almost like a life disadvantage, right? It's like it's greater than sports. It will affect multiple areas of your life simultaneously,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that makes sense. So in regards to, I guess, how to regulate the suggestions that you've made, is that done by what, like a blood test or something? Do you measure a person's testosterone? Like, how does that work?
Yeah, standard blood draw. One can measure any number of things, yeah, from that, and testosterone is certainly one of them. On the trans athletes that we test, we draw blood, and we get their testosterone levels that way.
Okay. And because I guess of the nuanced distinctions that you made in your article, perhaps the level of testosterone should differ depending on the sport, or what? Like, how would you
No,
measure?
no,
Oh, no? Okay.
no. Trans women, to compete in women's sports, trans women should be bringing testosterone down to female typical values, and once that occurs, then any differences are pretty minor in terms of a specific testosterone level within the typical female range. It doesn't really make any difference. But as an example of a sport that, in addition to having testosterone-based rules, World Volleyball has said that each national team can only put one trans woman on the floor at a time. They put that rule in. There was a Brazilian player who was quite successful in the very top league in Brazil's and in Brazil, volleyball is the second most popular sport in the country. So, she's a successful professional volleyball player in Brazil, and she's tall and big and strong and hits the ball hard. And they said, well, what if some national team put 6 trans women on the floor at the same time? So they put this rule in, but no trans woman, including this aforementioned Brazilian player Tiffany, has been selected for any national team to play volleyball. So this limitation of only having one trans woman on the floor at the time. Well, no team in history and international has had any trans women on their team. But I don't think this is an unreasonable rule. Trans women are taller. Height's important for volleyball. I don't think that rule is inappropriate for volleyball. I don't think it's a necessary rule for, say, for individual sports. You can't do that sort of thing. But in team sports, could you limit teams in other sports? Could you do that in basketball? Yeah, you could. Of course, again, no trans woman has made a WNBA team, despite the fact that their height is advantageous. So again, this tells you that that trans women aren't taking over sports. But if the WNBA put in a rule saying one trans woman per team, I wouldn't have a problem with that.
No, I think it's important to look at the statistics, and I'm very grateful that you have this knowledge because I don't do this type of research. I think unfortunately what tends to happen is that people who maybe perhaps come from a different political leaning will pick out particular stories, right? Like they'll highlight, look at, this one trans woman won this championship, and from that the lesson is, oh, we can't allow trans women into women's sports because they're just going to dominate everything, right? But your response is like, well, no, that's just false. If you look at the data, that is not what the data shows.
Right. What I would suggest is that we consider trans women to be a physiologically distinct subcategory of all women. And the physiological differences between trans women and cis women are important for sports and do need to be considered. But if we look at it this way, then we're starting from the assumption that trans women belong with other women in all walks of life, and including sport. There are many who would suggest that trans women are, quote unquote, really men who are invading women's sports. And then if you look at it that way, each successful trans woman becomes an affront. I would suggest otherwise. I would suggest that trans women belong in women's spaces, including sports. But we do need to consider the physiological differences. And I think this idea that it's not one trans woman being successful, but if trans women are disproportionately successful as a population, then that would be problematic. As you say, you see this all the time where, oh, a trans woman won something, therefore it's unfair. And I would push back against that argument very strongly.
Thank you for that. No, I think that makes a lot of sense, right? Again, like if you're a scientist, you want to look at the data, right? You're not just going to look at one particular athlete or this particular athlete. And that kind of relates to the next question I wanted to ask you, which was what would get you to change your mind on things, right? And it kind of sounds like that you've answered it already. Well, the data, right? That's the answer, the data. If it turns out that trans women tend to dominate women's sports, right? And the data, if that's true, then the data would reveal that. Then it would justify reconsidering certain limitations.
Absolutely.
Great. I think that's a perfectly reasonable position. Another question I wanted to ask you is if researching this topic has made you think about other categories in sports, right? Like maybe this is just me, but thinking about this one issue has made me think about these other categories, and maybe what we should have is just we should reimagine the ways that we categorize people, right? Like there are categorical differences, but perhaps it's not necessarily tied to a person's sex because individuals within a sex will vary. So maybe what we need to have is maybe like more specific biological difference categories. You know what I mean? I don't know if I'm making sense.
This is something that for instance, the Paralympics struggle with because they have a number of disabilities that they're trying to regulate, and how much do these disabilities affect people, and then how do you create categories? And the the thing with categories, of course, the more categories you create, then the fewer people there are to fill a category. And so if you create too many categories, then then you're not going to have sufficient levels of competition, and then something like the Olympics becomes hugely, I mean, it's already an enormous thing. If you triple the size of it because you have so many more categories, then that becomes unwieldy. And so it is a balance of trying to make your categories broad enough that you can fill them, and yet not so wide that you have people with hugely divergent biology competing against one another. So it is a challenge. One of the things that people have suggested is that trans people could have their own category. And World Aquatics has just done that. In the last year, they put trans athletes into their own category, and they had their first world championships earlier this month, in which they had a men's category, a women's category, and then a transgender category, which was called the open category. And they got 0 entries in the transgender category. So not a single transgender swimmer entered the world championships, even though, all you had to do was swim back and forth across the pool and they'd win a gold medal, right? But no one entered. And so I think that shows that, that in general, this idea, oh, if we just put trans people into their own category, that will solve things. It's not likely to be a good solution because of the sparseness of trans athletes.
Okay. But would you be against that in principle, though? Like, let's say for a particular sport, there were actually a sizable amount of trans athletes. Would you be opposed to that?
Yeah, no. If let's say if we had 3 reasonably equal size categories, male, female, and people who are in some sense neither entirely male or female. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. In today's climate, you would be outing people, and people may not want to be outed, uh, and many times that's the case. But let's say that there's not this prejudice against trans people, and some people who are somewhat outside of the binary make up a third of the population. Then by all means, I would be absolutely in favor of having 3 categories.
I see. Thank you for that. So this leads to my next question. I recently watched this interview with, I believe it was a trans athlete. I don't remember her name, but she was actually. I mean, and I think it gets tied up to the question of a person's identity. She was saying, like, look, the question that you have to ask yourself is if trans women are women. If you start with the position that trans women are women, then by default they should be included into women's sports, right? So the what you think about this issue depends on what you think on that more basic question.
Well, I said pretty much the same thing.
Yeah.
I said that trans women are a physiologically distinct subcategory of all women. That's a somewhat longer way of saying trans women are women, but with physiological differences that need to be considered for sport. But yes, the basic starting point is that trans women belong in women's spaces. And so yes, I do agree with that, and that trans people are who we say we are. There's people. Many people suggest that there's some dodge to this, that that trans people are somehow inauthentic or trying to be trendy, or or in some cases even suggesting that trans women transition so they can do better in sports. And all of this is ludicrous. Our gender identities are very real, and we are who we say we are. And that is a very important starting.
Thank you for that. Do you think that it's useful or true to make a distinction between sex and gender? The reason why I ask is because that same trans athlete didn't seem like she was making a distinction. She actually said that she was female. And so I wanted to get your opinion on that.
Yeah, the question of when to use female and male and women and men, it's not entirely clear cut, but it's not an unreasonable thing to, and in fact, in my recent dissertation, that's the language that we use. We reserve the terms male and female for people who are unquestionably 100% biologically male or female. So in that sense, trans women are not entirely female, and so you wouldn't say I am female. I no, but I would say trans women belong in the female categories. Whether we are talking about book awards or other things, and so this question of man, woman, male, female, it's a little touchy. I would acknowledge that as a trans woman, I am not 100% female.
I mean, just the way that you're presenting the issue, it really doesn't seem to be a complicated problem to solve.
No, I think it is complicated, and I don't think we are going to please everyone. Look, it is true that trans women do maintain some physical advantages even after hormone therapy, especially, as I say, in strength sports, sports where size matters. Certainly, currently, those advantages certainly don't outweigh all of the disadvantages that trans people have. But it's possible that, that in some world where we were more accepting of trans people and trans people grew up, being loved and supported, and that maybe in that world, if that ever happens, then maybe trans women do become overrepresented in sport, and maybe that does become problematic. But beyond that, you and I can sit here and talk and come to some reasonable conclusions. But there's a whole world of people with diverse opinions, and um, there are a number of people who are adamant that trans women are not women. Trans women are men who masquerade as women, and don't in any way belong in any women's spaces. On the other hand, there are people who would suggest that trans women unquestionably belong in women's sports without any restrictions. And so, I get hate mail all the time. I've been called the destroyer of women's sports, but I've also been called a traitor to trans people because I'm not a trans activist. And so, I get some nice mail too, but this idea that you can come up with this rational, reasonable solution in two people or in 10 people or 20 people in a room, and that the whole world is going to go along. No, it's not going to happen. No time in my lifetime. It's just, it will be a contentious issue for at least as long as I live.
I guess I can see where the opponents would be coming from, but I think a lot of that may have to do with more basic assumptions that we're making, like the assumptions that we're entering the discussions with. And perhaps there are maybe factual disagreements. Maybe I'm not entirely sure. And I think it's also like tied in with, certain political agendas, right? And that always makes it messier. That makes it more heated. And I guess the impression that I get from you is just like, I'm just an athlete. I just want to compete in sports. I want trans women to be able to compete in sports, but I also want it to be fair. Like it seems like you're taking a quite reasonable approach.
Well, thank you. I try to be rational, reasonable, and seek some sort of middle ground. Um, but that doesn't necessarily make everybody happy.
Yeah, no, definitely not. So it also sounds like to me that Because again, I think it might be because you're a scientist, right? You want to look at the data, and new data is going to come out every year, or every 2 years, every 3 years. And so what we need is an ongoing discussion, right? Like the rules are not set in stone. The rules we make and we can change. And so what we ought to do is just keep an eye on the data. You have scientists like you to look and analyze the data and perhaps collect the data and then help us determine what the rules should be for that particular year or until we get new data.
Yeah, I have advised many sports governing bodies, and one of the things that I tell them is that any rule that you make today should be considered a living document and subject to change if and when we get more and better data.
I think it's a good place to wrap things up. Thank you so much for being here.
You're welcome.